sunshine. I realize I am in sunshine. The skies are turning blue. Would you like to go to the top of sunshine?
I'd like to shift gears now. One of the reasons I really reached out to you originally was because I've had acquaintances who have made me aware of this thing called the universal model.
Mhm.
And you've got and I'll link to this as well. You've got a blog. Is that what it's called? A blog page or
Yep.
something where you talk about this. And so I'll link to this because you've got lots of good details here. But I was hoping we could just dive into some of these. Maybe let's start with just a little bit about like how did you become aware of this and why did you become interested in it? And what have you tried to do in respect?
Well, I actually met um, Dean Sessions, the guy who invented the universal model, probably 15 to 20 years ago. So I was a fairly new professor here, and he and his friend come knocking on my door, and and he wants to discuss his scientific discoveries with me. So I say, sure, come on in. And he starts talking. We're talking about Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolution. So this is standard reading for anybody who has taken a philosophy of science class, right? And so, oh, this is great. I know about this. So we shoot the breeze about that. Science, yeah, science is tentative. It's not, doesn't have everything figured out. We can have new information that can change things in a big way. Yeah, that's all good with me. And then he starts talking about dark matter, and which is sort of matter that astronomers infer is out there, as cosmologists infer is out there because of the effect they can see on it, but they can't see it because it's dark, right? and dark energy and all that kind of stuff, which is well, I'm not an astrophysicist, so I just said, I don't know about dark matter. So, and all this dark energy stuff. So he moves on and starts talking about geology. And he basically, he took a blowtorch to some quartz crystals, and which are a big constituent of rocks like granite and sandstones and whatnot. And he melted it and then let it cool off, and it wasn't quartz anymore. It was glass. And so he said, this idea that granites and things like that have quartz in it come from magmas, so molten rock, must be false. And I said, hold on, I can tell you what's going on here. The quartz it's crystalline, and which means it has a certain pattern of atoms that's repeated in 3 dimensions. And when you have crystals that form in from a melt, right? If you solidify it and like freeze it too fast, then everything's frozen in place, and those nice crystalline structures don't have time to form. And so that's why you get a glass. It's a matter of how slow the process is versus how slow or how fast or slow the cooling period is, right? And he was arguing this. I can't remember all the details of the conversation, but I finally said, I've seen lots of stuff about this. I'm a mineralogist, for heaven's sake, and geochemist, and so you're not really going to convince me, and so probably should cut this off. And he wanted me to read his manuscript that he had at the time. And I said, I'm trying to publish papers. I said, well, I just didn't think
Much of it.
Yeah, I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on this, what would to me seemed clearly like a crackpot science thing. Okay, pseudoscience. Anyway, so then years later, just recently, so some of the people in our department had some people bringing up this universal model in their class, and they had no idea what it was, but then looking into it a little bit, it was ridiculous to them, right? And anyway, so I got interested in this because I am interested in like how do you define science versus pseudoscience, and that kind of thing. And that's actually a more difficult problem than you might think, right? The whole shelves of books have been written about. It's called the demarcation problem. Okay, so I got interested in it, started reading it, looking at their website. I got a copy of their book from them, and it just it became clear to me that this was kind of a dangerous thing because sort of the homeschool type of crowd, religious homeschool type of crowd, might get sucked into this, and not because it had good arguments, but because it was so dishonest. So so I say it's dishonest because like, so if anybody, I'll tell this to anybody who wants to find out for themselves whether they should trust Dean Sessions. Read his book, but as you go along, look up his references, read the surrounding text, right? Read look up when he says geologists or whatever scientists believe this. Look that up. Do they really believe it? So he's constantly setting up straw men about what science, modern science claims, when it's either way more complicated than the way he presents it. So his demonstrations that it's false don't really carry the water, right? Or it's just 100 years out of date, or just wrong, right? He doesn't have the technical expertise to read what they say and sort of understand it in the kind of detail where he could restate it.
Have scientific training? I don't know about him. Does he have scientific training?
No.
Oh, okay.
Not even like he took a couple science classes, I gather, in college, and was really disgusted by how it was all evolution and
okay, so he's not a trained scientist that has turned kind of his back on science. He's someone who really never was trained in science and now has tried to jimmy rig and cherry pick and straw man arguments to fit the narrative he wants to tell.
Yeah, and it's like, and I don't want to say that he's intentionally dishonest. He very well might be one of these people who just psychologically can't process information that goes against their deeply held beliefs.
Right.
And so
although it is interesting,
sit there and say, oh, well, that's a good argument. But I would counter, you can't have this back and forth with.
And we don't need to, do bash Dean Stevens, but I went to that website.
Dean Sessions, this is me.
Or Dean Sessions. I went to the website, and it's like, as soon as you make 2 or 3 clicks, you're already being asked to buy something or donate or become a member. And so there's also some monetary, I think, reasons also that if he's been successful, as you said, in convincing people to use this system at least enough to probably make some money on this. But let's concentrate.
He's been doing this for 25. He's been working on this for 25 years. So I don't know that
maybe it hasn't been
really reasonable to say that he has a profit motive, or that I don't think that can explain what he's been doing for 25 years.
That might be true. Yeah. So let's look into some of these arguments, because you've written different, essays about this stuff. why? So what are some of the most clear examples of why you think it's pseudoscience?
Well, so for instance, going back to the blowtorch with the quartz, right? So he actually will grow quartz in a hydrothermal reactor, so an autoclave, basically, which is one way that geologists think natural quartz forms. It forms in different ways. Sometimes it forms from like hot water type thing, and sometimes it forms from magmas. So he mentions this idea that quartz, if you melt it, it turns to glass, not into this crystalline substance anymore. And so therefore he extrapolates that and says, he announces this law. It's like I can't even remember the name, but it's very fancy name for his law that says basically that all minerals are formed from water, not from magma. Okay, because of this one type of experiment that he didn't that didn't work for him. Okay, now he goes and tries to get comb through the scientific literature to get some support for his idea that you can't form minerals from molten mineral matter rather than stuff dissolved in water. And he'll quote various geologists and so on. And it turns out if you look up those very same sources, they will report how they did experiments where they melted some ground up granite, basically, in this high pressure, high temperature device that the petrologists call bombs. It, you can't make these huge, right? They have to be fairly small otherwise they'll blow up in your face. Anyway, they melted the ground up granite and slowly recrystallize it, and guess what? They made quartz, they made feldspars, they made other minerals that are in granite. And the reasons, so this is all reported in his sources, sometimes in the same paragraph as things that he quotes
in support of his idea, when in reality, when you read the original paper, it doesn't support his idea. In fact, it shows that it's not correct.
Yeah. So in answer to the idea that you can't create quartz and other minerals from a melt, which is what we call molten rock material, I would say, well, they have, they do all the time, right? And it says that in the same places where you're getting snipping little quotations to try and say the opposite. They are telling you this, and it's not, you're not processing it, right? So when I'll talk to people that are big into universal model, and bring this thing up, and this is really a central point. If you want to look through his books and see how many times he mentions that quartz can't be made from a melt, right? It's a lot. So it's a central point of his. So I'm not just picking some weak point, some side point that he makes. This is a central thing. I will say, okay, what do you say about this one issue, right? And what they'll do, a lot of them, especially the ones who work for Dean Sessions, they will just say, well, what about this and this and this and this and this, and they'll just shovel all this other information at you. And I find the best way to handle that is to just say, okay, maybe we can get to all that stuff later, but let's talk about this one issue, right? He says this, and he uses these sources to support it, but those sources actually say the opposite, right? And and a lot of them, they'll get mad at me about
Right.
that. But a few of them will um, will calm down and say, okay, they'll try and think it through, and it'll at least cause some cognitive dissonance for them that maybe later on
And I find
they
that
build
exact
up.
same comparison, like when I really teach someone about, I don't know, chromosomes in humans and apes, or, something specific about pseudogenes, like we really go into one case and I say, look, if this is this, then the rest of this can't be. But they don't like to listen to the one specific case. I found that a lot of anti-evolution people just keep throwing mud on the wall and hoping something will stick, right? Kind of like what you're saying. As soon as you attack,
Yeah.
as soon as you really want to talk about one thing, then they just say, well, and they go to a bunch of other things. So that's amazing how that same strategy I find all the time too in anti-evolution crowds as well.
Yeah, you can't let them get away with what's called the Gish Gallop, named after Dwayne Gish, the famous creationist
Yeah.
guy. Um, because that's how they do it. They just try and overwhelm you with all this stuff. But if you look at any one thing there, usually it's you can show how, no, that's garbage.
And it seems like that maybe the reason he wants to continually show this presence of water is because then that plays into the hydro earth and universal flood parts of his theory. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. That's really was his whole, I believe, reason for getting into this, was trying to show that the universal flood was real. Okay. And so he just went on this 25-year odyssey, or probably more than 25 years now, of just trying to find every little thing that could support him. And to the extent that he could realize that, okay, this particular branch of science is a problem for me. Like, for instance, measurements of the mass of the earth are a big problem if you think that the center of the earth is filled with ice.
So explain his supposition there, or what he's proposing, and then why that is erroneous.
Well, the idea would be, where would the water come from to flood the earth as much as it would take to do sort of a literal worldwide interpretation of Noah's flood.
Right.
And so it must have come from within the earth. Well, where's all this water? So he has a complicated theory about, okay, where's all this water? And it ends up with a ball of ice in the center of the earth. Okay, so along the way, with this big story he's putting together, he'll run into information that's contrary to that, like the mass of the earth. The measurements of the mass of the earth say that the central part has to be a lot more dense than what's on the earth, whereas ice is less dense than normal rock. So he has to attack the measurements people have made of the mass of the earth, and try and find problems with that. So he will. And so instead of modifying his views along the way, it seems like he's just sort of come up with clever ways to dismiss all the contrary information and just build up this huge edifice of just conjectures and things like that just it falls apart under any reasonable level of scrutiny.
Okay, so speaking of the flood, because a lot of people ask me about this too. I say someone says, well, wait a second, you're LDS, you teach at BYU, you clearly have a temple recommend, then do you not accept a universal flood? It says in the scriptures there was a universal flood. I mean, there was a worldwide flood. How do you like answer? What's your 1 to 2 minute answer if you've only got that to someone who's just amazed that this BYU professor doesn't think there's a universal flood? What do you respond?
Well, I would tell them what they need to do is just look at the history of LDS interpretations of that, right? And they will find a lot more diversity than they might think. Like, for instance, you can go pick up um, an essay by Hugh Nibley, right? Famous, he's a defender of the faith type of scholar, right? Well, um, he was talking about a local flood that was just described from Noah's perspective, right? That's one idea. You look at John Widtsoe, who was an apostle, but also a scientist, right? And so he would wrestle with this, and he published in the precursor of the Liahona magazine, right? And precursor of the Ensign magazine too. He published stuff about, okay, well, maybe there was like a big rain over the whole earth or whatever. So, all the surfaces were at some point fully submerged, or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
The point is that there are lots of ways that you can interpret that, that don't necessarily involve a volume of water that can't exist on Earth. I mean, we have some idea what's inside the Earth, and it's not what Dean Sessions says is in there, right? So we're just people like me or Hugh Nibley or whoever, they're John Widtsoe, they're just trying to say, okay, well, we could interpret it like this. What would be the consequences? If we interpret it like this, what would be the consequences? What facts are hard to explain under these different scenarios? And we're trying to be as honest as we can about it with ourselves and others. But I just figure if apostles can play around with different ideas about how to interpret stuff like that, well, I'm probably not going to hell for it. So,
okay, I love that. So first, take into account the diversity of opinions that might exist across leaders of the church, and not just read Joseph Fielding Smith or something.
Yeah,
But also, could you just tell, how did your specific knowledge, because you've got better knowledge about this subject than most members of the church. So how does your specific knowledge as an expert in geology and in, that did that influence you into saying, well, of course, then I can't go down the pathway of a worldwide flood? Did that influence you in that way?
Well, I think it influenced me in the type of information I'm exposed to, at least. I mean, I don't think you can discount totally the idea that I'm sort of under pressure because of my particular career to, take a certain stance on this. I'm a person just like everybody else, so I'm capable of feeling social pressure like that. But let me give you the piece of evidence that I would give to a friend who was asking me about this.
So besides the how to interpret stuff, now what's the one scientific piece of evidence? Okay.
So there are these geologic features called varves, VARVES. Okay. And so these form in lakes at the foot of glaciers usually. Okay. So the idea is, and what they are is alternating layers of light and dark sediment. Okay. Now, you have these alternating layers because every winter the lake freezes over. During the summer, you have some inflow of water that carries this light-colored sediment, ground up rock, basically, and deposits a layer of that. In the winter, it's all frozen over, and just whatever organic crud from living things was in there, just settles down in this still water and forms a dark colored layer. Okay. And you can go to one of these lakes that still exist now and drill down through it. And some places, like I know this one lake in Japan, where they can count back over 40,000 of these yearly layers. Okay. Now, what's more, with people who want to believe that in a really young Earth, they have to discount somehow radiometric dating. Okay, so using radioactive decay processes as a clock to see how old something is. Well, and one of the standard ones for those that work that, I mean, it's good for back, I don't know, 50,000-ish, maybe a little more years, is radiocarbon dating. Okay. Well, you can do radiocarbon dating on these dark layers in the varves of because it's dead organic material. So now, when they do that, they find out that the answers they get are pretty close to what they get just by counting the layers, right? And in fact, there are some assumptions and things that go into radiocarbon dating that aren't strictly always true. And so they actually use the varves and things like that to make corrections to radiocarbon dates, okay? So now if I'm thinking about this as a religious person who grew up, you know, in my house, it was all McConkie's Mormon doctrine type of stuff. And yeah, so you grew up the same way as I did. Right? So picture me trying to deal with this information. So now supposing that there was that the earth as we know it, at least, is only 6,000 years old, and that there was no death before the fall, right? And radiocarbon dating is, and things of that nature, were sort of messed up so that things look older right than they really are. That's sort of the typical creationist type of argument they'll make. Supposing all that's true, right? Then why do I have these yearly layers that I can count? And I know how they form. Because we can watch them form every year, right? Yeah. I know how they form. I can count how many there are. I can radiocarbon date them, and the radiocarbon dates match up pretty well with the counting. So if I'm going to believe all that stuff, then I have to believe that God intentionally not only just made everything out of nothing, basically, but made it to fool people into thinking the earth was old, like at least 40,000 years, like, right? So, and that doesn't work for me. Okay, you can believe that if you want, but it doesn't work for me. So I try and come up with some other way to deal with it.
Yeah, that it's funny that you went that direction, because in kind of all of my reconciling talks that I do, my first two principles are truth can come from anywhere, and my second principle is I don't think God is a deceiver. I just can't believe in a God who would do something like that to make it look like the earth is 40,000 years old at least, right? At least from one of these lakes, if in reality it was only 6,000 and the flood was what, 4,000 years ago, or whatever the universal model or other things would say. Yeah,
well, that's a really detailed thing to set up.
You know? Like why do that?
Really detailed practical joke on people to set up. So I can't. Good. I can't believe that.
I love that. That was great. Anything else from the universal model that really jumps out to you as particularly pseudoscience or a problem, because maybe it's convincing to a lot of people who don't have scientific backgrounds, you know, and they get a share on Facebook from an uncle who says this stuff is, this is the truth. And maybe a lot of other people are reading that because they don't have your background. Is there anything else that stands out to you that you'd like to mention about that that's particularly problematic?
Oh,
or would we have to be here all day?
Yeah, you're going to put the link in.
Yeah, I'll put the link in there
so they can go and look at it. Some of it is a little technical. The thing is, Dean Session doesn't do math, you know. Scientists use math as a way to say, okay, I have this idea, let's do some quick calculations to see if it can even come close to explaining what I'm trying to explain with it, right? Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, but he doesn't even go through that basic exercise of back of the envelope type of calculations to see, whether his ideas are going to work. And so that comes into play when he's talking about, he thinks that stuff we see coming out of volcanoes is all generated by earthquakes and things like that. Well, that doesn't work at all, right? There's just not enough energy for that to happen. And places where there's a lot of earthquake energy, you don't necessarily have lava forming, right? So, you go on and on and on, but he has no understanding of basic high school to freshman level physics, and it shows. Is what I'll say.
Okay, so you started this kind of with saying, you know, it seems like there was enough people who were buying into this, and whether it was homeschooling or whatever it was. So what's your advice to the mom who's looking for a science, science textbook, but wants some religion with that, and they go find this as a resource? What's your advice to them?
I would say I understand the urge to want to find evidence that supports what you believe, right? That's sort of a general human condition. But if you rely on stuff like this, it's just a bad argument. It's an obviously bad argument. Like I said, all you have to do is look up his sources to find out that this is really terrible. It's not intellectually honest, whether it's meant to be or not, So if you expose your kid to this and they're tying all their beliefs, religious beliefs, to this kind of presentation of science, they have a very, very high chance of being sharply disabused of that notion. And the typical response would be to throw the baby out with bathwater, right?
Yep.
So why not teach them actual science? And you don't have to teach it in a way that's like, this is how it is, right? Use that science as storytelling essay to help you understand how to talk with people about it, including your own kids, so that they understand what it is scientists are trying to do, and put it in perspective, how you fit it into your hierarchy of sources of information, right? It's you can do it in a way that at the very least teenagers can understand, that there's a lot of gray areas, right? Both in science and in religion, and how science and religion get mixed together. So
that's great. Well, I mean, I don't want to take too much more of your time, but is there anything like in your worldview that still causes a lot of cognitive dissonance for you, between your Mormon kind of viewpoint of the world and your scientific viewpoint of the world? Or have you pretty much gotten to the point where there's not a lot of those? I mean, I still have things where there's a little bit of, I wonder how that works, or wonder how this works. But are there things that are still itching at your soul?
Oh, I don't know. Things come up from time to time, especially things that aren't in my particular field of expertise. And so it's just like harder it would take a lot of work, right, to actually delve into that and try and feel like I'm making some informed decisions about how I interpret it.
And so if you're not, and I don't mean this in a bad way, if you're not willing to do that work, are you okay with kind of accepting what the scientific consensus is from that field? For example, evolution. I'm an evolutionary biologist. Let's say you don't want to do the work to read about evolution. I'm assuming you probably have, though, but let's say that you didn't. Are you okay with accepting kind of the scientific consensus from the specialists in those fields? Because this is the other pushback I've gotten, especially during this last year, is that people just don't want to accept scientific consensus about certain ideas, like mask wearing, or do vaccines actually make a difference? In this last year, that those have been two big issues that I've had to deal with a lot. What's your response to that?
Well, there's two different kinds of issues. One is just this religion and science type thing that we've been talking about, which, like, okay, science doesn't deal with the religious type of things, and so there are going to be conflicts. Okay, period. On the other hand, when we're talking about public policy, like what public policy in the history of government has ever had absolute, knowledge of how everything's going to turn out, and absolute knowledge of all the information going into the making of the decision and so on. When has it ever been the case, right? So just saying that science, this science is tentative and I don't believe it or whatever, that is fine if you want to do that, but it's a perfectly rational thing to do, to say, well, since I'm not going to put in the effort to get a PhD in this, and from what I can read, I can see some points on this side and on that side, and I don't really see how to resolve it. I'm going to see what most of the experts think about it, right? Okay, and then when I say, and then use that to say, okay, well, this seems like a reasonable thing to do, whether or not I totally buy into everything they're saying, right?
Right. Or
it seems like a reasonable, in a democracy, a reasonable way to like gather information to try and make decision. Another question to ask is, well, how many of the experts? What are the percentages? When you talk about things like climate change, it's something like 97% of the people who everyone would consider experts on climate change agree that humans are a big deal in that, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would just say to that person that that you don't have to have everything settled perfectly. That science never does that, right? Like settle all the questions, tie up all the loose ends and everything like that. But if you're just looking for a rational basis for making policy decisions, then you could do a lot worse than just trying to see what the most of the experts say and how big that majority is and so on, right, in order to weigh your options.
Yeah, I like that. Well, are there any last things you'd like to share, either in regards to the universal model or anything else that you'd like to share today, concerning science and religion and how they play together?
I don't know. I would encourage people who watch it to relax about the whole thing. It's there's a lot of things that are more important than that, but also you need to adopt a little bit of a flexible mindset about how you interpret things, and how willing you are to just look at things through other perspectives. And when you do that, sometimes you'll come upon cases where you really make startling discoveries that make a lot of things make sense that didn't make sense before.
Yeah.
Now, and one thing I always remind people of is a story about Joseph Smith. At least if they're LDS, I'll tell them this story. Yeah. So section, I think it's 137 in the Doctrine and Covenants, talks about his vision of the celestial kingdom. And he talks about all these people who were there. And he says, and I was surprised to see my brother Alvin there because he died before he was baptized. And so basically he thought that if you died before you're baptized, that maybe you could get to the terrestrial kingdom, and if you go back to the section 76 with the vision of the 3 degrees of glory, and that if you read it and try and think about what would someone think who didn't know about the whole work for the dead and all that kind of stuff, what would you think? And you can clearly see that it would be very easy to interpret that way, right? But what I gather from that was that Joseph Smith was misinterpreting his own revelation, right? And he got some new information, and he was surprised by it, right? So I would ask people to consider, what about your revelations? Are you misinterpreting them? Something like that doesn't mean that you're not getting the gist, right? But are you reading more into it than was really there, or whatever? Because everybody does that. So that's what I mean when I say, if you just relax about the whole thing a little bit, and if this is causing you grief, this is one area where even if you don't have the details sorted out, you can make sure that God's really there, right? This is something that can be done, and people do all the time, and that doesn't require a whole lot of scientific knowledge or any kind of specialized knowledge to do. And there's one section in the Doctrine and Covenants where it says basically, after the second coming, we'll understand this whole list of things about how the earth works and how everything works and all that kind of stuff. So of course we don't understand it completely nowadays, and you're not going to, right? It's always going to have lots of questions. So relax.
I love that. That is good advice. Well, it has been a pleasure this morning to be with you, Barry. I really appreciate your time and providing us your insights and perspectives on these things, and I really appreciate it. And
well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, it was great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Sunshine with me. The doors are open, the skies are too. Sunshine is coming in for me and you. Sunshine.